the fact that so many of you have been in this struggle for decades gives me so much hope. And keeps me going, you know? It reminds me, like, Camilo's still out here, and, you know, you all are still out here. And so I just wanted to start by saying how much that means to me. So thank you. Thank you for creating the space, for holding the space through decades of invisibility, of uphill battles, of seeming like the crazy people who were coming up against a system that was so powerful it wasn't even worth bothering with. Which was not my mom's words, but kind of my mom's first reaction when I got involved, like, but it's so powerful and it's always been like this. Like, I just want you to be okay, you know? And yet, I knew that I would be because you all are still out here through all of that, holding this space. And sometimes we go through periods, I think, of movement where that's what we need to do, right? We need to, like, keep the flame alive and hold the space. But thinking about, you know, what Danny shared, and Camilo and Deidre, I feel a visceral conviction that that is not the moment that we are in right now. Our work right now is not to hold the space. Our work right now is to move into a new era of opportunity that we have been presented with. And I have a whole bunch of data points and examples to back up my crazy theory that this is a moment that, you know, I think that many people I've heard say, like, you don't know it's a moment when you're living through it, right? I've heard some of my movement elders that I really respect talk about the 60s that way, even in the 70s, right? Like, that there was a sense that things were happening, but you, like, didn't quite know the moment that you were a part of. And I feel like this is one of those moments. Because for many, many reasons. The facts, right? We have unprecedented movement momentum right now happening in the United States. We have organic growth in About Face for the first time, I think, in a long time at these levels, right? Like, not that we haven't had people joining over time, but I'm speaking the history that I've been shared with, that, like, under Obama, that we had this height of movement happening, right, in the lead up to Obama's election, that, like, there was a huge movement to even push Obama to become as anti-war of a candidate that he became and take the positions that he was supposedly gonna, right, withdraw us from Afghanistan and all of these things. And then it happened, right, and then the kind of momentum fell out from underneath that because many across the left didn't want to be perceived as going against Obama. Didn't want to be, wanted to give the chance for the system to work, all of these different things. And here we are for years, About Face, struggled just to keep its doors open. Went from having, marches with tens of thousands of people in the streets and double digits of staff members to just trying to keep the doors open. And I think that that's the story for a lot of organizations in that era. And what I've observed as a person with fresh eyes coming in is that we're in this movement, and so many of us are still kind of going through the motions that we've been going through in survival mode and in scarcity for a while. And that's not wrong. That's not something wrong with, I think, anyone. That's not about an analysis. That's not about, like, a strategy or theory of change. I think that that's just a natural thing that happens when you've spent a decade just trying to keep the space and keep the flame alive. But right now, militarism is visible to the average person in a way that it hasn't been in maybe a decade, if ever. We have the military getting deployed. We've, like, invaded our own border, right? Like, we created this border, and then we're like invading our own border, basically, with our military. We have the military, what I consider, I'm not a legal, professional, but, like, it seems pretty clear to me that the military is obviously playing law enforcement roles in these camps, which is a direct, like, an obvious constitutional violation of posse comitatus, right? Just blatant. We have blatant attempts to overthrow Venezuela that are showing up in, to regime change in Venezuela that are showing up in the news that my non-anti-war wonk friends notice, right? And that's the thing, right? That's how we know, like, when it's not just all your anti-war friends sharing it on your social media, but you have, like, your friends being like, yo, like, what is the deal on Venezuela, though? Can, like, you give me the short version? But in all of this moment, right, like, we have to meet the moment with where it's at. And the couple things that I wanted to share is some of the observations I have about what might help us to meet the moment that we're in. And the first thing is that I've noticed we often move from like street corner action to street corner action to up to march, right? Like, we're doing a lot of activity, all of us, across organizations. There's a lot, actually, of anti-war and anti-militarist activity happening, but most of it is centered around the individual manifestations of militarism, right? We're talking about North Korea, and we're talking about Japan, and we're talking about China, and we're talking about Venezuela, and we're talking about Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Africa a little bit, and like, you know, we're talking about all of these things, and the reason that only we are listening to each other is because the rest of the folks are like, wait, can we back up to like, what do we do about any of that? I sit with my friends all the time, and they're like, yeah, no, that's horrible. Like, we're bombing 7 countries. 507 out of 535 are receiving significant campaign contributions of our Congress from defense contractors, and those are just the ones that are technically defense contractors and not all the other defense contractors, right? Like, all of these things, people are becoming aware, right? And they're like, oh shit, like, that's terrible. We should do something about that. What can we possibly do about like 12 wars that are happening around the world that you're telling me about right now? And so what I say when I bring this up, the reason I'm bringing it up is not to say we shouldn't continue exposing the truth and the patterns in all of these things the way that we have, but is to make the case that I think that it's time for us to come to a unified systems level conversation that is about vocabulary, so that there's a cornerstone of vocabulary that people have. And I think my theory is based in what has already happened with Me Too, with Black Lives Matter, with Occupy. All of those movements contributed and popularized what had previously been really academic vocabulary. Even 5 years ago, right? Like, the average person at a kitchen table couldn't define white privilege for you. They didn't have the language of the 99% and the 1%, right? Like, they didn't have the analysis of like what we're talking about when we're talking about like misogyny in the workplace and things like that. And like, there were cornerstone vocabulary words that were popularized by those movements that created the space for public dialogue and the popularization of analysis around these things that people have been developing analysis around for generations. And part of that's what I think part of like what we're missing in the like, I want my aunt sitting at the kitchen table to be able to thoroughly define what militarism and the military industrial complex are and how they show up across the spectrum, across social justice issues, things like that. And so what that means is like, we keep doing what we're doing, but we shift and come together around a strategy around popularizing the roots of the system. And I'm not saying that that's everyone's work. I think that we all relate to that strategy in different ways depending on what work we've chosen for ourselves at the local level, at the strategic level, the role we want to play, the talent that we bring, right? All of these things. But my point is that we have spent a long time fighting this war, and then the next war, and then the next war, and all of us hold the analysis that each of these wars are replications of each other, right? We see the same patterns, we see the same march to war that happens, we see the same narratives that are used to justify them. And I'm already only like 2 years in, and I'm too tired to keep fighting each war that pops up for the rest of my life. So I propose that, and again, I also want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that this is like a revolutionary strategic theory or anything that no one has ever thought of. What I hope this is like a reflection as a newer person coming in about what I have found as really helpful for myself in rapidly building a deeper analysis, and what I found really helpful for people across the center, from the center to across the left, to deepen their analysis around militarism, around the idea that, like, actually, since we have unprecedented movement momentum in an unprecedentedly intersectional way, we actually don't need to build a new separate anti-war movement. We need to build the capacity for anti-militarist analysis within the broader social justice analysis canon that is already being actualized across across social justice spaces and across the movement and across our societies already. The thing I think that we need also to actualize that well is that we need to build a practice that is intentional and productive in how we relate to each other, from elders to brand new people, across generations and across areas of work. And I think sometimes when I talk, I frustrate people because they feel like I'm dismissing the work that they've done for a really long time, and that's also mine to work on, right? Like the communication barrier around communicating what I'm trying to communicate. Because what I'm actually trying to communicate is I feel desperately in need of that history and knowledge in order to feel like I'm continuously rooted in, first of all, the legacy that the movement that we're trying to build right now should be rooted in. And also in order to feel like I see clearly. Because what I've learned through all of this, I feel like all of us who are veterans, especially in the room, should relate to this, is like that I will continue to have these like eye-opening realizations for the rest of my life where I thought I knew an entire thing to be true and then it turned out that it was completely not. And I think that only by being rooted in the histories of the movements that we're building on can we do that. That said, that relationship also requires us to be, again, disciplined and intentional about the way that we relate to each other across generations. Because what I see happening is people who hold all of this knowledge and all of this experience, who, by lived experience, for understandable reasons, don't know how to connect that to a current, like, energized base of, like, millennials and Gen Z folks. Right? And so that knowledge is getting lost and it's getting wasted and squandered instead of being translated into intentional mentorship and the intentional development of new leaders that requires us to move out of the way, to create space for new leaders, but like hold on to them and be like, let me pour into you and develop you and tell you what I learned so that you can pick up this mantle and run with it well, and not have to make all the mistakes and relearn all the things we learned the hard way all over again. And I think sometimes in our fear that the experience that we hold is gonna get squandered, right? That we've spent 50 years, some of us, toiling to learn these lessons the hard way. In our fear that that's gonna get squandered, we hold our space instead of imparting it, right? Instead of transferring it forward. And that only guarantees that it will be squandered, that it will be lost, right? So it's a classic case of like, I'm gonna hunker down here because this experience is needed, but in doing that, you crowd out the ability to replicate a next generation of cadre who are gonna pick up that mantle and run with it. And that is what we're seeing, in my opinion. I think there are really great examples of like what I'm talking about happening in really positive, constructive ways. But I think as a whole, I go to the predominant anti-war spaces that I see who hold the most resources, who hold the most wealth of experience and history, and there's no space for what's currently happening to be translated, to be brought in. And so that's a corner I think we have to turn in order to meet this moment that we're in. I think that if we don't meet the moment in that way, then we will be squandering all of the things that have been built over the past generations for the moment that we were building them for. And maybe that's a little like arrogant for me to say, like, I know that this is the moment you were building it for, but I feel like this is the moment that you were building it for. So that's one thing. The other thing is, Camilo referenced it a little bit, but our expanded thinking about what anti-militarism means. And this comes back to the analysis that I was sharing around, like, how do we stop fighting each individual war as it pops up and start dismantling the system that allows those wars to keep being justified and popping up and blah, 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 right? How do we do that? And I've become convinced through mentorship of people like the Deidras and the Camilos who fought for the expansion of this analysis that was then imparted into me in About Face. I've become convinced that the only, maybe not the only, let me be less definitive, an important strategic path to ending the Iraq and Afghan wars, for example, that we started out with laser focus on, like we said, is getting at the roots of the system. So it's counterintuitive to some extent, right? Like, we keep thinking we need to rage directly at the conflict. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be talking about the conflict at all, but we need to be talking about it in a way that is constantly and consistently coming back to a simple systemic analysis. Why is this happening? Every single time, right? Why is this happening? This is happening because this country was founded on this. This is happening because even the placement of military bases on this land was in response to indigenous resistance. That the first children who were taken from their parents were the boarding schools for Native American people on this land once military suppression wasn't enough. And they could tell that indigenous people were just gonna keep fighting the military efforts to suppress them, and that it would be more effective to use school systems to control the education and culture that indigenous kids were receiving away from, to divorce them from their culture, tear them away. And it was one of the most effective ways to suppress indigenous culture and threaten the extinction of indigenous people on this land that there was in our history here. And understanding that is a strategic necessity. Understanding that at the practice level, right? I think almost all of us probably have some level of theoretical analysis of how we were really fucked up to indigenous people on this land. That does not always translate to a practice of deepening our understanding of what it would look like to decolonize our analysis of militarism and the way that we go about trying to achieve anti-militarist objectives. But if militarism on this land was created in response to indigenous resistance, then how arrogant of us to think that we could figure out a way out of it, right, out of the roots, without deeply understanding the characteristics of the system that were used to suppress indigenous resistance. We don't know anything else. From a cultural perspective, even our leftist analysis, right? Like, we don't know anything else. And the only place for us to look is the wisdom of trying to understand what was here and what was so powerful that it had to be suppressed through genocide, through military genocide, in order to take, conquer, right? Like, exploit, extract, all of those things. And if we don't take the time to understand the characteristics of that system, then they replicate themselves in our individual behavior, because all systems of power are ultimately enforced interpersonally. All systems of oppression are ultimately enforced interpersonally. Brass tacks, right? And so that's why it's not just so that I can be a good leftist. It's not just so I can be a good guy in the movement. It's not just so Brittany will stop yelling at me in meetings, right? Like, I don't yell, but you know, I do get fired up. I do get upset. It's because it aligns with our morals, and our morals are the guiding star of what the reason why we supposedly exist in movement, right? And I use morals outside of like I don't know, I think the way that we think about the word associations we have with morality, but maybe principles is a better word, right? Like the principles that we are trying to enact in the world, ultimately, like if we don't figure out the characteristics of the systems at the very detailed practical level, then we end up unconsciously replicating them because of course we do. And that is that doesn't just make you an asshole, that makes you unstrategic. And the other reason that I hear like this justified about why we shouldn't spend time on this is like, because we need to do the work. Well, hopefully I've driven home the point at this point about, you know, at least my perspective, that like that is the work because it is strategically necessary in order to have an analysis that is sound enough to have a chance at winning. We cannot win without it. Just from a theoretical perspective. And then from a practical perspective, a woman who facilitates for us at About Face one time, she said, Indigenous people and disabled people are going to save organizing because their very existence depends on rejecting systems that were entirely designed around their impression, right? And like most of the time don't have a choice but to like exist in contradiction to those systems. But that's real, right? Like if we want to win, like I'm tired of going, I'm not tired, I just got here. But also kind of I'm tired because I don't want to just go to conferences. I don't want to march and I don't want to stand on a corner with a guitar like for the rest of my life. Please don't take that the wrong way. I want to fucking win. And if the thing we're trying to win against is the thing that was designed around oppressing Indigenous people, then we need to fucking have a decolonization lens in the movement, right? Like in practice. And wrapped into what that means is that we also need to understand the relationship between patriarchy and capitalism and colonization, right? A lot of us understand that at a high theoretical level, right? Like you could probably give me like a really smart dissertation on like the relationship between those things. But the like crystallizing relationship between those things is the commodification of bodies and resources and the ranking of bodies based on an assignment of value based on proximity to a European understanding of cis manness and whiteness. And that manifests at the systemic, institutional, and individual level, which means that the institution can have a whole bunch of black folk and still be a white institution. And that's why we're not gonna win if you just like go round up a few of us, people of color, and are like, we got some, we out here, you know? Like that's not the same as an analysis. Sorry, I feel like I'm on a little bit of a tirade. Okay, back to the point. And let me just take a moment for my like trans and non-binary siblings to make the connection that I feel like some of us are probably trying to make and struggling, which is that like the very nature, right? That like I think I see some of us write online, right? Like, I'm not fighting against the trans ban because I don't want more people in the military. Well, I don't want more people in the military either. But I understand that the reason that people are attacking trans people in the military is because the military is based on, I said it a minute ago, a European understanding of cis-manness, right? Like it's a particular stable political definition of what it means to be a man that is enacted in our values, in our practices, right? The idea that like physical strength is strength. When we say strength, people immediately think physical, right? Like I have equal muscles to a man and that means I'm strong enough to be in a role, whatever. Like all of these values, that violence is an effective solution, right? Like all of these values that are based on that system, that are the values of a patriarchal system, and that trans folk and non-binary folk, by their very existence, reject that system, right? Their mere existence, even if they're trying to squeeze themselves into that system in one way or another, their very existence is a threat to a system that is based on valuing people, based on their proximity to a European understanding of like manness. Manness is going to be a word by the time I'm done with this speech. I don't know that it's an actual word. Well, anyway, so that's why the other thing, right, is that like because it has become, which is unique to the United States to some extent, right? In the United States, being a military officer is like the third most respected profession in the United States, above like teachers, nurses, doctors, surgeons, like all, judges, lawyers, like a whole bunch of things that should be pretty respected, trusted positions, right? And so, of course, if you live in a society that is built around rejecting your existence, then like you're going to be attracted to a system that allows you to be respected and validated, particularly in the context of expressing masculinity or expressing your ability to connect to masculinity as a non-male-bodied person, women. And so we need to understand our efforts to protect our trans and non-binary siblings as harm reduction. Right now, the military is the largest employer of trans folks in the United States. That's not a mistake. And institutions, by the way, while I'm on this tangent, and then I'll wrap up, I promise. And institutions, when confronted with people whose identities fundamentally challenge the stable understanding of valuing, right, of the system of valuing and valuation that they depend on for power, they have two options. One, you explicitly reject those people, deny their existence, right, all of those things. The second thing you can do is, if that doesn't work, then you groom folks, you throw them crumbs, you throw them limited opportunities for power and validation, and they become the good Negro, right, to put it in James Baldwin terms. They become essentially, right, like the equivalent of the good Negro who's like, oh, but this one's mine, and they're like behaving well, and then they get used, even when they feel like they're enacting change within the institution, right? The institution adapts to place them into positions of power and then use them as cover and as shields from criticism against racism, misogyny, things like that. Because then the system can be like, no, look, we have some though. Like, we have some. What are you talking about? And that's how people of various marginalized identities get played against each other. And those two options play out systemically and institutionally over and over and over again in every industry, in every category across our systems, because that's how the system maintains power. It rejects or it adapts and incorporates, but while maintaining limited access to control and power, right? And if we understand that characteristic, I'll land this here. That's the other reason why when we are in spaces and we do this thing where we're like, we want you here, we just don't want you to have too much control or decision-making power or authority or anything because you need to like pay your dues or what, I don't know, whatever weird excuse is given. That is a replication of the characteristics of the ways that institutions upholding systems of oppression maintain their power, no matter where you are, in nonprofit, in the military, in a business, wherever it is. And that's an example of why if we don't understand the characteristics in practice, then we have this high-level analysis, but when we try to struggle against it, we miss the mark because we end up accidentally replicating those characteristics in our work. And I think the revolutionary thing that's happening right now, many revolutionary things I think are happening, but one of them is that people are digging into and grappling with those systems of oppression at the practice level inside the movement. And that is worthwhile because it's necessary for our values and our integrity. It's worthwhile because if the types of leaders people of color, indigenous people, black folk, queer folk, trans folk, whatever, right? That like are the most impacted by this system that oppresses all of us are the ones that are gonna lead us out. If they can't survive in our spaces because they're replicating themselves, we can't win. And then the last strategic thing that I just spent all this time talking about, which is like our analysis is actually not correct strategically. We are making poor strategic decisions when we don't understand the way that these systems replicate themselves and maintain power over the long haul. We address the symptoms, right? And then they evolve. And that analysis came from an understanding of the ways that women, that black women in particular, in Bell Hook's book, Ain't I a Woman, when she talked about the history of the narratives that were used when black women were a broad-shouldered, strong example that flew in the face of the understanding of femininity and women as like petite and delicate and fragile. Their very existence contradicted that. The answer of the system had to be, but they're not women. Right? And it happens again when, we're like, oh yay, winning is that we have like all of these women generals who are still enacting all of these, who are still in charge of a machine that does more harm to women around the globe than any other that exists. Right? And so forth and so forth and so forth. And we miss those things when we see these things as distractions from the work instead of the core of our work. So with all of that, I invite us to continue digging into that. I think that we're in a moment where that's happening. I'm excited to be in struggle with all of you in that because I think that this is the moment, and it would really be a shame if we didn't come together and build the movement that we need in this moment to win.